Welcome everybody to this week's Happy Hour. Today, your host is ISFSI First Vice President Seth Barker, who is joined by two very special guests, Dan Madrzykowski and Keith Stakes from UL-FSRI. Some of the audio got cut out from the live session, so we will begin with Dan giving an overview of what they have been doing at UL-FSRI.
So we've got a lot of data, and this kind of shutdown time, everybody work remote, has been giving us an opportunity to catch up. And the value of this stuff, it's really focused on coordinated attack and getting the coordination between the suppression tactics and the ventilation tactics. And as you know, we've been working on this kind of subject matter, horizontal ventilation or just vertical ventilation, PPV, things like that, the basement fire experiments, looking at flow paths through buildings and how the buildings respond to fire for 10 to 15 years now, pretty steady. And what's coming together now is we're really able to put a lot of those pieces together to make it just not any one tactic, but how you put the size up together with your incident action plan and what it is you're going to decide to do, how you're going to put these things together. Now, of course, there's always variables of what your staffing is, what your resources are. Is it a single engine company showing up, or is it two engine companies and a ladder, within a matter of minutes, and how your decisions are going to be made. But the key is we're able to put the physics together for you so you can understand a cause and effect relationship. And I could let Keith tell you a little bit about what we're doing with regard to the reports that he's working on and that are coming out, as well as how we're trying to transition some of this stuff to training.
So I guess with that, to build off of what Dan mentioned, we're trying to figure out what our new normal is here. And I think we've done pretty well so far without skipping a beat, and have actually been starting to churn out a little more content. We should actually be out in the field right now working on our current search and rescue project and beginning the fire test for that series. But with that, we're actually now obviously at home trying to play catch up on everything else. And so far, we've been able to put out the single family homes report, the strip mall report, and then currently we're wrapping up the report for garden style apartments and multifamily dwellings. So that project, as Dan kind of hit on, is really a culmination of numerous years of research leading up to this point, where we're trying to now capitalize on what we know about individual tactics. So we've studied suppression by itself. Here's what appears to be the best methods in certain cases. The different types of ventilation, horizontal, vertical, positive pressure, and then really how do we take those and combine them together and find out what the best sequencing of events or events done simultaneously on the fire ground really are. And that's trying to take a look at, your first engine and your first truck that get on the scene. How are our tactics best coordinated given the type of structure, the fire presentation, the weather conditions, and so on. So really it's to try and take what we've done in the lab where we've isolated the tactics, put it all together, do it out in the street in partnership with the local fire departments, and see if those tactics hold up. And then also take an exploratory look into multifamily dwellings. So again, garden style apartments for us is roughly a 3 to 5 story, typically wood frame building, may or may not have an enclosed stairwell, and also may have balcony exposure issues on the exterior of the building. So in this particular case, it was seeing how our residential tactics, do they scale up to multifamily? And what are some new challenges with the fact that we have basically a path of egress now that we would need to protect, being the enclosed stairwell, and then taking an exploratory look into strip mall fires, which again is an occupancy type that we haven't done much work in previously, to say, all right, now not only is the structure type different, but our fuel load is drastically different. So a lot of different avenues we could take this conversation. I guess to hit quick on the point that Dan mentioned about training. The idea here is that coming out of this project, we're trying to put a holistic approach onto the training product with this, in the sense that this wouldn't be a training product that necessarily focuses on this particular project, but maybe compiling a lot of the research up to date taking into account what we've learned from the coordinated project, obviously, but then really looking at it as kind of a capstone product that says, all right, here is a large overarching training program that could be delivered on coordinated fire attack, and what are the best practices that go around that.
Yeah, I think to echo what Keith was saying too, is that, you know, these recommendations that UL are putting out are simply that, the recommendations, right, of how to safely and effectively mitigate the hazard that you're dealing with. And, you know, based on your response profile or your organization or your training program, is going to really sway that either way on how you accomplish that. So keep that in mind as well. But I think everybody on the call has drank the Kool-Aid, so to speak. So the first question that we had out there, I'll go back to Dan, is you know, how can we get on the same page with recognizing a vent limited fire, Dan?
So a vent limited fire, if you roll up and you've got flames extending out of any opening, that is a very, very clear sign that you've got a vent limited fire. Similarly, if you roll up and the neutral plane, if you open the door and the neutral plane is fairly low or middle of the door or below, and you've got heavy smoke rolling out of there, the fact that a good portion of the door is going to be serving as an air intake means you've got a good working fire, provided you've got a high velocity flow above your head. And that also is going to be telling you that, hey, I've got a vent limited fire here. When you've got a fuel controlled fire or fuel limited fire, normally in a residential, that would be very early in the growth stage. Smoke's going to be light gray. It's going to be moving slow. It's not going to be evident of a rapidly growing fire. I mean, sadly, or I mean, maybe it's easy. You just have to, I would say, run under the assumption that if you're responding to residential fire nowadays, your assumption is vent limited until you can determine otherwise, because we've shown time after time that it really only takes a single piece of upholstered furniture in any room of the house to be able to transition that to flashover.
Yeah, very good. So if we do have a vent limited fire, what's the key recommendations that we're thinking about when we're recognizing that it is event limited? What next, so to speak? You know, where's that hose line going? Are we going to open up the box? Are we going to keep the box closed? What are you guys seeing in your current research?
Well, by definition, and we think about the fire triangle, the vent limited fire has an excess of fuel. It's got heat. The thing it doesn't have enough of to continue to generate flaming combustion is oxygen. And so if you introduce more oxygen as a first move, the fire is going to get bigger. And depending on how long, what stage it's in, or how long it's been vent limited, it may take, and how big the box is, it may take 30 seconds to recover and start to grow again. It may take a couple of minutes, but you know, you're assured that it is going to get bigger. So then it's a matter of timing and how fast you can do things to get water on it or make an approach. But there are times now that we're looking at, people call it different things. I'm not sure what the right word is. NFPA 1700, I guess, is going to call it non-ventilation or anti-ventilation. This idea of like using door control sometimes, or you roll up on the scene and maybe somebody left the door open when people were leaving the house, and you take a look in, there's no victims there, you're not ready to fight fire yet, you close the door. You can, by keeping the fire rich to some degree, there are cases when you can use that to your advantage if the fire basically is still sort of contained in a box kind of thing, the roof's still intact and all that sort of stuff. So those are the pieces that you want to be looking at with, you know, what's your next step, what's your next move. And we're going to try to be building some of that into the online training program that we're developing with you guys for basement fires that will be coming out later this year.
So some of this, to build on the timing piece that Dan's referring to, it's again going to depend on the type of structure, going to depend on your staffing, going to depend on your arrival order. But there's, you know, a couple schools of thought about whether or not you're going to vent immediately prior, simultaneous with, or just after suppression. And, depending on the choice of suppression method that you'd employ on the fire ground, we see the benefits of the flow and move about when you open the line, you keep it open the whole time. You're actually using the hose stream and the air you're in training with it to control the flow path. There is an advantage there to having a vent ahead of you. If you're, confident in what the structure type is and the configuration and where your vent is in relation to where your suppression crew is, there may be logic to basically pre-venting, a couple seconds before that line starts opening. Obviously, timing here being critical and key, knowing that as soon as you do vent, you've obviously introduced an oxygen source, and therefore you're going to support more fire growth. But again, if that's timed with suppression, that could be used to your benefit. Now, there's nothing wrong with flowing and moving into a dead end. You're just not going to entrain as much fresh air behind you. So if you have that vent ahead of you, not only are you controlling the flow path and protecting space behind the nozzle crew, you're also entraining fresh air from whatever vent opening you have behind you. So we saw that in fire attack. We saw that in the coordinated project. If you've got a vent ahead of you and you open the line and you flow, not only are you stopping the products of combustion from coming back over the nozzle team, but you're also bringing fresh air in and clearing up that space that's behind you, further increasing victim survivability there. But again, different schools of thought. But the bottom line is that as soon as that fire is knocked down or under control, or whatever the verbiage is, we've got to get that cleared out as quickly as possible. And it's, again, based more so on your response model and your staffing and what you arrive with which means you're going to choose to ventilate that structure. But there's all these remote pockets of the building that aren't going to necessarily be in the flow path that you're going to be approaching in with the nozzle team or the truck team that's going in, that are going to need to get ventilated very quickly as soon as that fire's knocked. It's the places that are not in the flow path where we're not going to find the victims right away that are going to benefit the most from quick ventilation after the fire's under control.
Yeah. Jack had a question, Dan, just backing up a little bit. He said, needs some clarification. It believes you said that when flames were coming out of the windows for vent limited flames, coming out would be fuel limited, if I'm not mistaken, not vent limited, when you're seeing flames coming out of the windows. Can you just clarify that?
Yeah, that is very much vent limited. The whole reason why it's burning outside the window is because it's too fuel rich to burn inside the structure. So we've got a lot of test videos you can watch where you can sort of see that process evolve. The fire builds up in the structure and either flames start to come out of open door or start to come out a window that's venting. And in some cases, as that allows the fire to transition to a really full flashover, the additional heat release rate inside that room of origin creates even more fuel, so it gets fuel rich inside the room of origin, and sometimes it can actually put the flame that's at the window out, because the amount of raw fuel coming out is just so fuel rich, it can't entrain enough air just outside the window. It's got to flow away from the window, maybe 6 feet or above the eave, and if it stays hot enough, then you'll have the fire above the eave actually. And then when it leans out a little bit, but it's still fuel rich or vent limited, then the flame will come and attach at the window. So, I mean, that's why we have flames sort of coming out of that room, because it's vent limited.
Okay, good.
And the only place it can find the oxygen, enough oxygen to burn, is outside of that space.
Okay, awesome. That clears it up for me. Hopefully.
And that would be sorry, Seth, one more point to add. So that would be the same thing if you had fire showing from the roof. That would be the same kind of concept there. If you've got fire coming out of the roof, it's the same thing about fire showing from a window. Basically, unless you're catching these fires in a place where the neutral plane is not dropped in the structure and you haven't transitioned, a compartment, the majority of these fires are all going to be ventilation limited. If you can hit it with a can and you can get there and actually see, you're obviously catching it in the incipient and the growth stage. But beyond that, it's pretty much ventilation limited across the board.
Okay, Pete, I'll get to you here in 1 second. Caleb had a question real quick. Keith, when you're talking about flowing the nozzle and flowing and moving and bringing fresh air behind you, Caleb had a question saying, how is that different than positive pressure attack? They feel like they're missing something on that.
So the one struggle with positive pressure attack there is the coordination of the fan in conjunction with suppression. So where I'm leading to with this is the fact that the nozzle is in the nozzle operator's hand, and that controls what the amount of air is that crew is going to be bringing in with them. And basically that can be started and stopped at a moment's notice based on what that nozzle team is feeling or hearing from an adjacent truck crew or something like that. Whereas a fan at an exterior opening, yes, is going to introduce fresh air into the structure, but I would say that it's not such it is not in such a controlled manner as it would be by the hose line itself. So, depending on how we're employing our hose streams, even a straight stream or a solid stream is going to entrain air with it. Typically when we're advancing towards a fire or a compartment, we're not going to just hold that stream fixed. We're going to manipulate it in some sort of pattern, whether it be an O, T, Z, N, what have you. That's going to increase the amount of entrainment. So you're actually doing what you would be doing with a fan. You're just doing it in a more controlled manner when you feel it's appropriate. And obviously, if things start to go south, typically we're not going to see them go south with water because we're bringing water with us. Whereas with the fan, we might be introducing air into areas that we're not able to control with suppression, and it gets a little bit more gray there with the coordination and timing.
Awesome.
And with the PPA, you really need to have you really need to understand your flow path very well, and you need to really be well trained in using that. If your exit is not larger than your intake, then this is a little counterintuitive, but the fire is going to come back toward the front door where the fan is. And just because you're blowing in there, 10,000 CFM or whatever it is, and you've pressurized the structure, keep in mind the fire is generating some pressure itself. So if the exit vent on the fire room or wherever you're trying to drive that fire flow to isn't large enough to drop the pressure in the fire room, any pressure you introduce to the fan is going to be added to the pressure in the fire room, which means the fire room is still at a higher pressure than the rest of the house. And high pressure always flows to low pressure. So it'll flow back to the source of oxygen, which is now the fan, and come toward the front door. The other thing with using the hose line as creating your pressure differential to move smoke and heat through the structure as you want is you're also providing cooling right there, and at least locally protecting the crew, and in many cases using some techniques that we've been collected from the field. We didn't invent any of them, but from seasoned firefighters and whatnot, and used in the experiments of flowing water down the hall and say bouncing it off the door frame as a means of angling a broken stream into the fire room, even though you're still 20 feet, 10 feet away. You're having an impact on that fire, and hence making it better for anybody else that might be stuck in that structure.
Chief Pete Van Dorp, did you have a question?
No, I was going to chime in a much less effective way than Keith and Dan just did, so I'll keep my mouth shut.
Okay, and then I saw Brad French is on the screen there. Did you have something to add there, Brad?
Just real briefly, I think to maybe provide what I would assume hopefully is a little bit more context to what maybe Jack's question was. I think intuitively when people think of like smoke showing, for example, just smoke showing from a house, then intuitively they can kind of get on board with that being a vent limited fire. But then the point that that obviously Dan is trying to emphasize is that even if you have fire showing, there's still more unfulfilled energy there, if you will, that's going to continue to take that fire off more the more air that it gets. And so while just smoke showing is intuitively, everybody's going to be like, oh yeah, vent limited. Well, no, even if there's fire showing, it's going to be vent limited. Even if there's fire showing, the more you vent, the more fire is gonna show up to the party, if that makes sense. So I think that, and those of us that are instructors kind of getting that lesson, that idea across, that just because there's fire showing, that certainly doesn't mean that there's not going to be more fire if there's additional ventilation in that situation. So I think maybe that's what's driving some of that question, is that even though there's fire showing, yes, it is still very much ventilation limited. Hopefully I didn't mischaracterize that, Dan.
No, no, not at all. I mean, so if you think about an attic fire and you look at any of our studies that we've done on attic fires, and another shameless plug, we're doing a redo on our attic fire course, and that's being reviewed now. So that should be out in a couple of weeks, I would hope. If you've got flames showing from a gable or flames showing from an eave, the entire attic is not involved in flaming combustion. The entire attic is hot, it's untenable, it's pyrolyzing, it's generating fuel, but it's so fuel rich it can't breathe, and the only place it can burn is out of those openings. Similarly, when we did the basement study and we had the walkout basement door, the basement was kind of arranged in a U shape, if you will, and we started the fire on, let's say, the left end of the U, and then it worked its way around the stairwell to the right side of the U where the ventilation was, where the open door was, so that when it did transition a flashover, all the burning was at the end of the U by the doorway, within 6 feet of the door. And if you went any deeper into the basement, it was, temperatures 800F, 1000F, high heat flux. No, but the key thing is there's no oxygen back there. The only place the fire could get oxygen was coming in that sliding glass door that was open at the basement. And as it burned up all the oxygen, any area behind it that couldn't get fresh air wasn't burning. Again, not tenable, not pleasant, full of smoke, still generating more fuel. Things are still off-gassing and pyrolyzing, but it couldn't burn back there because it couldn't get the oxygen. And I mean, for fire investigators, this is one of the challenging things to understand this, because we started that fire on the other side of the basement. And so when the fire investigator comes, they're going to see an obvious origin over on the other side of the basement and a hell of a lot of damage by the door. And if they don't understand the fire dynamics, their assumption is, hey, we've got 2 points of origin. This is an arson. And there's a lot of people that have been put in jail for that and are getting out of jail, some cases many years later, because of that lack of understanding.
John brought up a good point, our brother up in Alaska, saying the Palmer's Dollhouse is a great way to demonstrate this as well. And even I think we're calling it the Billings Dollhouse now, which is our basement fire prop that we're going to try to demonstrate with our hot training basement fire delivery, which is an excellent time to talk about that a little bit as far as what the status is of the grant and when are these classes getting pushed out. Lee, you want to chime in there real quick about that?
Sorry, couldn't find my mute button. Sure. So we're just talking about our regional delivery of the basement fire classes. Yeah. So obviously, with what's been happening, we had to postpone our launch of those classes. However, we anticipate that right after the first of the year, we'll be able to pick back up. We will be doing 18 classes. They'll be regional in approach. Right now, we're working within state training agencies to try to maximize our exposure to that. The intent is that we are trying to work within the instructor community for the students in those classes. We're not calling it a train the trainer, but the intent of the program is to help provide tools and resources and obviously skill sets to take back to your departments, so that we can easily get the materials you need into the hands of your department so you can start training effectively.
Awesome, thanks Lee. And so me and Dan have been talking a little bit and they've been working a lot on their online delivery. Dan, you want to just touch base on that real quick for the basement fire stuff?
Sure. So again, we're having an opportunity to take another look at what we put together in the form of a report and what we were using for the sort of 8-hour delivery, and learning some lessons from delivering it face to face, and trying to understand what some of the key takeaways were for the students. We've been trying to design an online class that includes some more interactive features and some scenarios, so that you'll see pictures of a house or be given a scenario and then try to understand what you would do with that in terms of how would you impact the flow path? Where would the fire move? Where would the heat move? What kind of attack do you want to do in terms of coordination and fighting the fire on its own level? So we're trying to get those, give you an opportunity to work with those lessons. Certainly not the same as hands-on training, but it sort of could be the introduction to a hybrid training, where then it would make great sense to go to a training academy and do some different hands-on activities to solidify the learning.
Yeah, you know, I got a glimpse of these scenarios the other day from Dan, and they're awesome to say the least. And also, this is going to be one of our prerequisites for attending the hot training, is most certainly for all the instructors that are at the basement hot training, but the students as well. So it's going to get everybody a really good base as far as what they need to know prior to being engaged, so we can just hit the ground running. I'd like to rewind it a little bit here, Dan, and we were talking about when we're recognizing event limited fire. The question that I always get every single class, every single Principles of Modern Fire Attack class, every single basement fire class, and then also the troops back home, is how much time do we have once we open that box up? And you know, my standard answer is it depends, but maybe you can give a more intelligent answer than that.
It depends.
It certainly does. You know, how big is the volume that's involved in fire? If you have a relatively, say, a townhouse that has 600 square feet or so per floor, and you've got the living room or a bedroom, you know, pretty actively burning, but it's already in that fuel rich stage, and you opened it up and a lot of smoke is rushing out over your head, a lot of fresh air is being sucked in. It could be as short as 30 seconds, or it may be more like 2 minutes. If you have a 4,000 square foot two-story colonial with an open floor plan, it's probably going to be even slower to respond if you only open a single door. Now, one of the challenges with some of these bigger houses, and if you have a pretty good response, is that what may happen is more than one door gets opened at any time. A crew's going to go around to the rear and pop a door, somebody in the front's going to pop a door, and now you're sort of speeding up that fire's recovery, if you will, by letting more oxygen in. And with the two-story open floor plan colonial, we had a phenomena occur actually for some experiments we were running for NIJ, the National Institute of Justice, where the front door turned into a full exhaust for about 30 seconds or so. And when we normally talk to you guys about flow path, we normally have an intake and an exhaust at the front door, and very rarely, and if we vented a whole bunch of things upstairs, most of the front door could turn into full intake, but very rarely do we have this scenario that it's full exhaust. And shortly after we ran that experiment, there was a fire in a bowling alley in Alpha Lanes in Troy, New York. And I don't know if any of you remember seeing that video clip that was making the rounds, but they had this full exhaust coming out of a second-story window and then part of the downstairs level for about 30 to 45 seconds. And it's like, wow, kind of interesting. And then so we made our own. And Keith, I'll let you talk about that with regard to the strip mall experience.
All right, so we're in Fairborn, Ohio, and we have our strip mall unit. It's an L in shape. Most of the units are about 30 feet wide by anywhere between 65 and 80 feet deep. And then we had one double wide unit, which was basically the full 60 or 70 feet wide and the full 70 feet deep. The one thing that's unique about the commercial structures is that the actual true ceiling height is going to be a lot higher than the opening to the exterior of the top of the door. So you're actually able to build up a lot more smoke and heat and products of combustion above that doorway before they start to exhaust. And based on the fuel type that we chose, which was kind of a rapid growth, what we call commodity box, it's used for sprinkler testing. We started the fire in the opposite corner from where the front door was. In this unit, it was just a single wide open door, roughly probably 32 by 80. And that fire was able to get going quick enough that basically the easiest way to understand it is the fire growth was able to outpace the ventilation, and it increased the pressure in that space so quickly such that before that fire was able to translate to vent limited, we had basically a pressure push that was sustained out that front door for on the order of 45 seconds or so. And, it went 75, 100, 125 feet from the building. And it was moving at such a velocity that it picked up pieces of drywall on the ground and threw them out into the parking lot. And it was really impressive. We were all wondering what was going on, like what's about to happen to this building. And then as quickly as we were trying to figure out what's going on and what we need to close and are people okay, it basically reverted itself back in. The front door became a complete intake for a period of a couple seconds. And then we started to again see smoke out of basically every orifice in the structure. But it was quite the phenomenon that, again, we've seen before, like Dan mentioned in the Alpha Bowling Lanes video.
So rewind it again a little bit here, Keith. What is your biggest takeaways or aha moments from the coordination attack study that you guys have been working on? And what do you guys think for a timeline of that coming to fruition?
So I guess that's a twofold question. Kind of my biggest takeaway as of the past couple years has really been a deeper understanding into victim survivability. And I wanted to bring this back up to what we were talking about earlier about how Dan mentioned fire showing from gable vents doesn't mean that the whole attic is on fire per se. The same thing, applies to to a room where there's fire showing from a window. And hopefully some of you have seen the video that came out of Fort Walton Beach. It was the Stone brothers, I believe, that were down there in Fort Walton Beach, and they had a deemed to be vacant structure that they showed up to in the middle of the night, had heavy fire from the front of the building, multiple rooms, and had a confirmed report of somebody trapped in the rear. That person you could hear from the exterior of the structure. You could hear the woman calling for help, but she was behind a boarded up window. The police arrived there first and were starting to break out that OSB on the window. It was actually screwed from the inside, not the out, and was actually pretty well done. So they had quite the time to try and get this open. In the process, they're now obviously introducing a new source of oxygen, but the entire time you're hearing this woman still calling for help. And as they get that window opened up a little bit more, the engine company shows up. They make the decision to deploy that line to the rear of the building. When they do so, they start to get that window opened up even further. And then while they're there getting masked up, ready to go, again, that was their choice point of entry to go to closest where they thought the victim was. That window, then the smoke then lights up at that window. So, immediately you think, okay, crap, this lady that was inside here, that just lit off now, we're in trouble. While that window is still showing fire, you still hear her on the inside calling for help. And she is in that exact room where the window was showing fire. So that case, in combination with our fire attack research, in combination with the coordinated attack research, really kind of drove home for me a lot about victim survivability. And where once I would look at a window and say, that's showing fire, nobody's going to be alive in there. I do not at all have that opinion anymore. And, I'm really big into this. I think it's about searchable space, not survivable space. And it's about how we can employ our tactics as effectively and as quickly as possible to make an effective search of an area, because it's not up to us to decide whether or not that's a survivable space. So at least takeaway wise for me, that's kind of been the biggest thing, is understanding really, that the visual presentation is not going to always lend itself to what's actually going on the inside.
So what do you mean, Keith? What do you mean by searchable space versus survivable space? Maybe dive into that just a little bit further.
Yep. So I guess kind of a crude representation of just trying to say, is it a space that we can safely occupy as the fire department and be able to search and clear that on our own? So not a visual assumption from the exterior of saying, hey, we're going to write that area off and that area off. I don't think there's going to be, survivable space, if you will, there. And we're going to focus our efforts elsewhere. Whereas I think maybe the mantra should be more of, all right, how can we make that a searchable space if it's not currently? And then how quickly and effectively can we get to the areas that we know are searchable?
Good. That's good. Thank you. So what are our resources for coordinated attacks? So what can we use to buy ourselves more time? What are kind of the benchmarks we're looking at as far as when to apply event, when not to? What did you guys see from that current study?
I think the one piece I'll touch on that's been on my mind a little bit to bring up is the concept of door control. And I think, door control is not something that we necessarily want to blanket apply across the board. And where I'm going with that is if we go into a structure where we don't know where the fire is, or we're not able to get water on the fire as quickly as we'd like to, the door control is something we need to employ to slow that fire growth until we can take control, right? But then as soon as we get the line open, and if we're employing a flow and move tactic, we want to take advantage of the fact that we can pull fresh air in behind us. So if we're choosing to do a flow and move and we know we're getting water in the direction of where the fire is, it would be my opinion, based on what we've seen, that door gets swung full open, and we take advantage of the fact then that not only are we bringing more fresh air in behind, but we're also allowing the smoke that's behind us to exhaust out. And I think where this may differ a little bit is on the structure type. So if we move into multifamily, and I won't go too far into this, but if we move into multifamily and we've got a protected stairwell, door control is something we may want to employ regardless of the tactic to be able to keep that stairwell protected. You could almost go so far as to say there that if the stairwell's protected, make your attack from the exterior, go in through the sliding door and leave the stairwell closed the entire time. So, that it's kind of a very deep question that we could open up a lot of avenues with about timing and coordination. As long as you're within a relatively close window, and I don't really like putting a time to it, but a relatively close window with venting either right before or during or right after, as long as those actions are happening, pretty close with suppression, you're in good shape a lot of the time, as long as water's flowing.
Yeah, that brings up that New York video of opening up the door into the shared stair or the shared hallway, and the smoke just pouring into that hallway. I think, Dan, you gave me that video to put in one of our presentations, but yeah, that really rings true. Go ahead.
You want to keep in mind is it's called door control for a reason. It's not called door shutting. The idea is to be in control of your openings, right? Not I mean, many of us were brought up with open it, check it, open, 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 right? And the idea of door control was to say, be in control of your openings. There's a time and a place to open things up, and there's a time and a place not to, and just change your way of thinking. It's about controlling the ventilation process until you've achieved effective suppression, right? And especially until you've achieved effective suppression, and it's not a set it and forget it kind of process. You don't open the door and check it necessarily. You want to be, in control of your openings. So control the doors, right? And I think Keith made a really good point there. There's a time and a place to open it, and a time and a place. But if you're in control of it, then you can accomplish that. That's the point.
Yeah, Brian had a question there of how many of us are using smoke curtains. We started out in Montana, we started using these almost immediately because we only have 4 to 5 people for the first 35 minutes on a structure fire. So we have to be kind of really well thought out as far as our tactics go. But we've deployed, since we put those smoke curtains on our engines, we've deployed those at every single fire and have been highly successful with that. And that's kind of taken that position out of the game of that person being able to walk away, multitask, and then go back up to the door and either open it or keep it shut, but not having somebody married to that position. So anybody else have any thoughts on smoke curtains or what they're using?
A person at the door is a better option for a lot of reasons. But when you don't have that person, that curtain really does give you some very good effective ventilation control. So
yeah,
we did the same thing in Algonquin. Same idea.
Yeah, Jason, go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, Seth, we've been using them for about 8 years, and Pete's exactly right. A person there that's thinking, that's understanding, that's communicating with the interior crew is the absolutely best. But when you look at a similar situation to you there in Big Sky, Seth, we arrive on scene with 3 people and limited water supply without hydrants. We have to maximize technology to help us facilitate those positions. And so we're cognizant of, once we get water flowing in that compartment and we're in the attack function, that it's time then to start to improve ventilation and improve the conditions inside that structure. But until we get coordinated water on the interior, we're not opening up when possible, just because we're limited staffed and we only come on scene with 1,000 gallons of water and we have to maximize it.
Yeah, similar situation for us as well. So what are our options for coordination, Keith? You know, what are our resources? What are we thinking about when we're getting ready to deploy this tactic?
I think it would just be making sure that the first engine officer and the first truck officer, you know, at a minimum, because they're kind of setting the tone of the incident, assuming, you know, that's kind of what we're talking about here, a 2-unit, you know, showing up. You can get a lot done with just those 2 units. And as long as, you know, those 2 units are on the same page, you know, it's obviously a little bit easier to coordinate if it's just a single unit response. Obviously, you're manpower limited. But as soon as you start to scale up in units, obviously coordination gets a little more complicated. So I would say, you know, the long-standing adage of so goes the first line, so goes the fire. There's a lot of truth to that, but it also goes in with what that first truck is doing, or whoever, for that matter, is assigned to ventilation. You know, as to whether or not your department is one that's going to simultaneously vent or wait to hear from the engine that they've got water on the fire and they're going to follow it up quickly with venting. You know, the options are kind of across the board as long as we can get water quickly and then the entire structure vented as quickly as possible thereafter.
Yeah, good. What questions do we have from the body here? Does anybody want to pose a question? Chief Lead, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I just want to add, so Keith has now said, he's talked about the ventilation simultaneously. So depending on your staffing, that's an important point, right? We're either doing it, we're closely coordinating it. We're able to do, because of our staffing in New York City, we're able to do a lot of tests simultaneously. But if you're showing up with 5, 6, 7, 8 firefighters, you're likely doing them sequentially. So that's a really important consideration that shouldn't be lost on the group that he's mentioned several times.
Perfect, thank you. So how do we buy time, Dan or Keith? How do we slow this whole thing down? And if we're not ready to open the box up, how do we not set the reset button, but push the pause button?
I mean, as was talked about earlier, door control is a big way to buy time. Not venting ahead of the line is until you're ready, getting that, whether it's a 10-second or a 30-second or simultaneously type of thing, that's how you're buying yourself time. If you roll up on the scene, and I know in many response areas, the police may have been there first, or a neighbor may have been there first, and the door's already wide open. If it hasn't flashed over yet and you don't see anybody's feet laying right there and you're not ready to fight fire yet, close it, right? And start buying yourself some time. What if you have a very low response and you're a 2-person engine company that showed up and you're waiting for another engine company and you do have fire shown from the window? hit from the exterior with tank water will slow that fire growth down and buy you time. I mean, it's interesting to go around the country and talk to folks that have been on the Houston Fire Department for 40 years and they're now, you know, division chiefs. And they're saying things like, you know, one day we showed up and that red booster line wasn't on the engine anymore. And we never talked about it. We never trained any differently. We never really spoke of it. It just disappeared. And he said, you know, back in the 1960s and 1970s, we put a hell of a lot of fire out with those. And, you know, is that the thing you want to be taking interior? No. But you can, I think what our studies have shown is that you can do an awful lot with 1.5 inches or 1.75 inches in tank water really early in the event if you can get a jump on the fire.
Brad, how do you farmers do it down in Dayton?
Nice. Well, you know, I'll tell you what. Instead of, because I was just sitting here thinking, I had the great privilege of being on the technical panel for this most recent study, the coordinated attack study, and I thought maybe what I would do, at least as a small contribution, just a couple of the things that jumped out at me on some of those burns and when we were doing those. One of which on the commercial on the commercial strip mall fires that Keith had mentioned earlier, that phenomenon that he was talking about, I think I missed that that particular day. I wasn't there. Keith, was that the day that it kind of like filled up the trailer a little bit?
Yeah, that was the day that drove us out to find other shelter.
But anyway, another interesting thing at that was, and slightly less dramatic, admittedly, but on one of the control experiments, one of the very first ones, where it was just essentially the fire was going to go and it was going to stay buttoned up and allowed to essentially naturally go ventilation limited as just kind of a baseline. The fire built up so much pressure in a relatively rapid period of time that it actually burped open that front door. And I was there that day, and everybody was kind of like, well, what in the world's going on, right? And the fire had built up sufficient pressure to burp open that front door, and we had a significant amount of smoke showing for a period of time out that front door. So even in the what was essentially an intent to create a baseline foundational vent limited fire to then build other data off of, that just goes to show you that you can't really plan everything out. I mean, the fire's going to do what it wants to do sometimes, whether that particular issue was anticipated or not. And so there was a lot of, between that story that Keith mentioned and then what I saw that day, certainly a lot of lessons learned as far as pressure development to me, as far as that study goes. And then another thing that I thought was interesting one day, up at the Burns up in Sydney, I was standing there with Nick Papa from up in Connecticut, I believe, and we're watching the fire. And Keith, I'm sure you were on the interior push at that particular time, but we're watching the windows and waiting for the vertical vent to be pulled. And when we waited for the vertical vent to be pulled, what I thought was interesting was that I thought, even having studied a lot of this stuff, I thought that I would see at least a temporary rise in the neutral plane of the windows. There was a neutral plane in the windows with some bidirectional flow, and I thought at least temporarily we would be able to visually see, looking for those visual cues of at least maybe a momentary rising of the neutral plane at those windows. And it never came. As soon as that vent was pulled, it just, more and more fire out those windows. And it just really went, to me at least, it spoke to me of the importance of coordination and the fact that if you have a vent limited fire and you give it more vent, it's going to make more fire, even if that ventilation configuration is out the roof. I thought that was an interesting takeaway for me. There was really, at least in that particular experiment, no obvious rise of the neutral plane, even when I was really anticipating it. As far as the way we do things down in corn-fed Dayton, Ohio, I'm not really a great one to talk about it as far as vertical vent goes, because I'm kind of in the philosophy that we don't do vertical vent, and Dayton does. I mean, we're a decent sized job. We're 12 stations, 340 folks, and do 300, 400 working fires a year, and we don't go to the roof. We very, very rarely go to the roof, and all of our fires go out just fine. And so I'm not really of the vertical ventilation persuasion from a personal standpoint, and so we don't do a whole lot of rooftop stuff here, but we're getting much better about coordination and much better about door control, pre-entry, and a lot of the things that Dan mentioned earlier about finding open doors on a 360 and purposely closing them if the situation calls for that, and so on and so forth. So we don't do a lot of vertical. We're getting much better very quickly about discipline in our horizontal.
You probably wear plastic hats too. Hey, we got two questions out there, one from Jesse and one from Greg. Jesse, you want to explain what tell us what you're looking for?
Yeah, sure thing. I'd love to. So the question I have is, if you could spend just a minute talking about the impact of the cubic footage of a structure in relation to the square footage of a structure. So like a 2,500 square foot house with an 8-foot ceiling versus a 2,500 square foot house with a 16-foot foyer, 16-foot great room, something to that effect.
It's a Dan question.
So, yeah, so it gets back to a little bit what Keith said as well, that in the commercial structure, you've got a much higher ceiling, 15-foot, 16-foot ceiling relative to the height of the door. So that gives the fire more oxygen that's already in that box that it can use to burn. And it doesn't need oxygen from the outside as soon in the fire development as it would in a smaller house with 8-foot ceiling, 1,200 square foot rancher. So if you've got a 4,000 square foot colonial with a 16-foot great room and an open foyer and all that kind of thing, it's got a place to store the smoke. And what is the smoke? It's fuel, right? So it's building up a lot more fuel inside that structure early on, and it's got more air to pull out of that structure to maintain the fire growth rate. And so that's why we saw in that that colonial open floor plan design colonial, when we only had a front door open or a front door and a first floor window open, where we would get to the point where the oxygen inside the house was enough to allow it to flash over and create that big pressure surge and then push down and have this full exhaust at the front door for some sustained period of time until the pressure balanced. And then it said, hey, you know what? I'm not growing anymore. I've cut off my air supply. I don't have enough air in here for combustion. And then all of a sudden you got this normalization of fresh air going in the bottom of the front door to feed the fire, and exhaust gases coming out the top. And now in that big volume, even though it's a bigger volume, the amount of fire that's actually burning at that point in time is now reduced and limited to just the same kind of thing you'd have in the ranch house, because it's limited by the air that it can get in through that front door. And it can't generate any more heat release rate than what it can get in through that front door.
Very good. Greg Harris had a question for you guys. He's wondering, has there been any studies on different windows, single versus double versus triple pane, that show indicators of how long before the window will fail? He specifically was thinking about strong winds hitting the window, and if it fails, can it change the interior conditions on the interior crews? So do you guys have any experience?
Yeah, windows are tough. So there were some studies done. Fred Maurer did some studies specifically just on window type, single pane, dual pane. What causes a window to fail is actually a stress intensification factor. If you notice, if you are at a scene and you see a window that's cracked, or you noticed a cracked window due to heat, that crack will always start from the frame. So basically the window's getting hot and the part of the window that's in the frame that's being protected remains cool. And wherever there's a slight chip or a slight discontinuity when they cut the window, that's where the crack is going to start from. So how it's mounted, what the frame is, if it's just a vinyl frame window, it's like, regardless of how many panes it is, the probability that the vinyl is going to melt first and just drop the entire window pane out and open it up, whether it's a single, double, triple pane window. If it's all vinyl frame, that's a big problem. That was one of the challenges in the Diamond Heights fire, where the firefighters died in San Francisco, and that 20-foot wall of windows opened up. They were all in vinyl. It wasn't wood covered with vinyl. It was just a vinyl frame. Wood frames are much more durable, but then how's it plastic insulation, or is it, mounted in? There's different methods there. Steel casement window, the discontinuity between the steel heating up and the window glass typically will cause that window almost to explode or pop out. So the bottom line is, this occurred in the fatalities in Houston and others. Losing that window caused a dramatic change in the flow path and resulted in all firefighters being run by fire. So one thing, when we're teaching, we ask fire officers, if you've got a wind-driven fire, let's say coming from the rear, and you're downwind trying to push up against the wind, and at the moment that you're making entry into the house, it's okay. But you're taking the risk that there's a glass there probably less than a 1/4 inch thick that could fail and literally create life-ending conditions for your crew. So, is that a risk worth taking, or do you take the time to get the wind at your back and fight that fire?
Hey, I'm gonna just try to take a second. Mike, so you're not, it is causing lots of background noise for those who are speaking.
Okay, I just wanted to, as we're wrapping this stuff up, I wanted to make sure that if anybody does have any questions, they can type them in and text them to the chat, or they can raise their virtual hand, so to speak. But if you didn't get your questions answered today and you still have some burning ones and you want to get them answered, just feel free to email them or create a thread on isfsi.org in the member forum, or you can email them to me, and that's sbarker@bigskyfire.org, and I can forward them to Dan or Keith, and we can try to get your questions answered. Dan or Keith, I'd just like to kind of wrap this thing up on what are resources on the UL website, what are some courses that we can be concentrating on, and what do we have to look for the future?
So our website, ulfirefightersafety.org. From there, we actually have launched a new LMS, which is a much more modern with the times, I guess, if you will, platform where all of our courses are hosted. We can actually have master accounts for departments, so you can actually manage training within your department, so on and so forth. But all of our courses are listed there. And then from our website, we have links to not only, again, the LMS, but also all of our current and past research, not just the presentations, but also pictures and videos that went along with the experiments that really kind of ties it all together.
Yeah, we started implementing this within our monthly training program of taking a course with UL for our entire fire department, and can't speak more highly of it. I think it's really well polished, really well done, which gets me even more excited about the basement fire stuff course coming out very, very soon as well. My email address again is sbarker, B as in boy, ARKER @bigskyfire.org. I'll put it up on the chat. And in closing, Dan or Keith, do you guys have anything to add?
No, just appreciate your guys' time today. Thanks for sitting in with us and the opportunity to be here.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's always good to hear questions from folks. That's the benefit of the sort of face-to-face training or the virtual training now, as opposed to just people going through what we have online for them, is sort of understanding what the continuing questions are, because that helps us design the next research project.
Yeah, I can't say enough thanks for you guys taking time out of your extremely busy schedule to come and join us on this platform. It's a real big deal to me and a super honor to be able to have you guys doing some face-to-face time with our membership, and hopefully we can continue this and be paying it forward in the future. So Lee, do you want to wrap this up for us? No?
Everybody, it's officially happy hour on East Coast time, so I hope everybody has a great evening.
Okay, thanks again, Dan. Thanks again, Keith. You guys stay healthy out there, and we'll see you guys next week.
Bye.
Take care, guys.
Thank you guys all for chiming in.